This may surprise you to learn, but I'm a woman in my 70s who has been listening to stories on the internet for many years. So let me explain why I'm telling this. My dear grandson first played one for me in the car during a family trip, and 3 hours later, I was completely hooked on the voices, the stories, and the calm way they were told. Recently, out of simple curiosity, I asked my grandson if the host of those programs was married, and he said no. I laughed and told him that if I were 50 years younger, I might try to ask someone like that out on a date. My grandson joked that the idea sounded like the beginning of a wild story about an old lady tricking someone online. He started to explain what catfishing meant. I stopped him right there and told him I already knew exactly what it was. I explained that I had once been caught in that very situation myself. His jaw nearly hit the floor when he heard that. He is 20 years old now, but when he was still in school, I was already around 70, and he had never known I went through anything like that. My own son never knew either, because the whole thing was a little embarrassing for me to admit. My grandson begged me to tell him the full story of what had happened. When I finished, he encouraged me to write it all down properly. I told him I was perfectly capable of doing that on my own. Now, all of that brings me to the strange experience I want to share. My husband Frank died back in the 1990s in a sudden and violent incident. Before he passed, he always told me that if anything ever happened to him first, I needed to promise I would at least try to find someone else to make me happy in my later years. I never truly wanted to do that because Frank was the only man I ever loved. Still, after some time had gone by, my grandson Elijah insisted that I learn to use a computer and the internet. Not long after that, I began seeing pop-up advertisements and messages about dating services. They claimed there were wonderful single men right in my area, which sounded ridiculous to me. I have lived long enough to recognize a scam the moment I see one, but those ads did make me curious. This was around 2017, if I remember correctly. Online dating had become fairly normal by then, and many people were using different websites and phone applications to meet one another. I decided to try something simple and old-fashioned, so I signed up for a well-known dating site called Match. The name sounded respectable, and the whole idea seemed harmless enough. Before long, I began speaking with a gentleman who called himself Daniel. His profile picture showed a handsome, gray-haired man with a warm smile. I thought Frank would have approved of someone like him. Daniel came across as kind, polite, and thoughtful in every message he sent. I could spend a long time describing all the charming things he said about himself and the pleasant life he claimed to live. But as you already understand, this is a story about deception, which means every bit of it turned out to be untrue. I arranged for a lunch date in Georgetown because old dears like me prefer to be tucked into bed by 8. So I met him at a pleasant open-air cafe that I visited from time to time. But the man who arrived introduced himself as Ryan. The man who sat down across from me was clearly Ryan. I could recognize the facial features and the jawline, and he was certainly a very handsome man. The problem was that he looked about 23 years old, and I can be exact because he later admitted this to me. Now, I remembered that Daniel had once shown me a little computer game on his phone where he took a picture of himself and made himself look old, and he ended up looking just like Frank. He then took a picture of me and made me look young, and I looked just like I did in my best years. That was when I figured my date had taken a photograph of himself with that same game or app, and then used it as his profile picture. And I simply stared at him, and my mind went straight to all those scams people talk about. Now, her story came to mind as I sat there. My dear friend Margaret had fallen for one of those tricks some years ago, and you often heard about elderly widows and spinsters being charmed by young men hoping to secure their comfortable fortunes. Now, surely this could not be happening to little old me. I stared at Ryan and sipped my cup of coffee and said nothing. And he just gave me a rather odd smile, and said that he was not quite what I had expected. Huh. I said no. No, he was not. And I was very old and had no patience for these kinds of strange games. And please, could he explain exactly what was going on before I walked out? Now he gave me another grin, and I recognized it as an attempt to be seductive. Then he asked if I would have agreed to meet him if I had known he was 23. I said no, honestly, I would not. And he responded with, "Well, there you go then," as if that explained anything. So I asked why he wanted to meet me in the first place. And he said, wasn't it obvious? I was incredibly attractive, and he was interested in women like me. Like really, truly interested in women like me. I asked what he meant by women like me, and he winked and grinned and said that he meant senior, because women like me were always more experienced, more seasoned, and more willing to push boundaries. He then went on to say even more vulgar things that would have made me blush if I had been less of a prude. And I most certainly was not flattered, though. The way I saw it, a man pretending to be 50 years older than he really is in order to trick an old widow is no less dishonest than those odd men who pretend to be in their 20s and show up for dates looking very obviously like they are in their 50s. Deception is deception, Frank always used to say. Now, this man, Ryan, was suggesting that it would be an honor for me to spend a passionate night with him, and he would show me things he was sure my late husband would never have dared to show me. Now that made my blood boil. Nobody spoke badly of Frank. Nobody. Ryan was just lucky that Daniel or my son were not there, or things would have gone much worse for him. I stood up, knocking my teacup over and spilling the lukewarm tea onto Ryan's lap. He did not like that at all, and he jumped to his feet, calling me a foolish old woman and saying my failing memory was keeping me from enjoying the finest evening of my life. I sharply told him he had no right to speak to a lady in that manner, whether she was his own age, older, or any man for that matter. I added that tricking and deceiving elderly widows rarely leads to romance, and only makes a person look deeply suspicious. The stranger snorted, looked me up and down with an ugly sneer, and announced that I obviously was not some wealthy widow, and he had no interest in taking my pension or my paperback novels. He said he had been placed on this earth to give lonely, worn-out old women like me one last taste of excitement. Then he leaned across the table and whispered the most unsettling thing of all, telling me his greatest fantasy was to bring on a deadly heart attack through the strength of his own passion. By then, other people were beginning to notice us. We had been the only ones sitting outside, but several customers had stepped out of the diner while he was ranting, and a few people walking past slowed down in concern. From where they stood, a harmless older lady was being threatened by a much younger man, which was precisely what was happening. This fellow, who called himself Ethan Cole, had no idea that a woman had come up behind him just as he was finishing his sick confession about wanting his manhood to end an elderly woman's life. The passerby clearly did not care for what she heard, because she swung her handbag and struck him hard on the side of the head without a word of warning. He spun around and began shouting at the woman, claiming she had attacked him and calling her a vile name that started with a W and meant a woman who teases farmyard birds, insisting I had led him on. Nobody believed that story, coming from such a predatory-looking young man, when compared to a polite, gray-haired lady who kept saying that no, absolutely not, and that he had deceived her and might even be trying to steal her retirement money. A small crowd started pushing him away, telling him to move along before he found himself meeting the Lord far sooner than this old woman ever would. I was grateful for their help. It had been many years since anyone had stood up for me like that. Not since Frank passed away. and for a brief moment, it felt like another lifetime. The feeling made me careless, and I failed to react when Ethan hurried off like a frightened child. Perhaps I should have contacted the police, although I wondered if pretending to be older on a dating site was even against the law. When I took a cab back to my house later that day, I opened the application on my phone and saw that the fool had not even removed his profile. Instead, he had sent me a message filled with insults, calling me a nasty name and an ancient hag, and claiming he would send me a photograph of himself to show what I was missing if he were allowed. Since you will be reading this aloud, Mr. Daniels, please let your audience know that he spelled the word as Y-O-R. I captured screenshots of his profile and the message he sent me, and forwarded everything to the trust and safety team at HeartMatch. I called Daniel and told him the whole sordid tale. He was furious, of course, but a little amused as well. After all, Ryan never really knew who he had been trying to seduce. My husband, Frank, had his faults, and there were many times I did not approve of the things he did, but he had once been a respected enforcer for a certain crime family in Chicago that will remain unnamed. Frank had left that life behind years earlier, yet the past eventually caught up with him in the late 90s. He was tragically caught in the crossfire of an incident that had nothing to do with him. What he did leave me was a very comfortable nest egg. I am exactly the sort of person men like Ryan usually try to target. It took every bit of my stern grandmother energy to forbid Daniel from hunting him down and teaching him a lesson he would never forget. I decided that being made to look foolish by a woman in her 70s and having his behavior reported to the dating service was punishment enough. It was nearly 8 in the evening when everything finally settled, and I was more than ready to call it a night. Not long after that, I found myself thinking about another experience of my own. I am a lesbian trans woman, and I use a small dating app designed for older members of the LGBTQ community. It is meant for people who lived through complicated decades and simply want some peace now. I am in my mid-40s, and all I have ever wanted is to live quietly as the woman I know myself to be. I spent years speaking with doctors and going through evaluations to be certain transitioning was the right path for me, and I have never regretted it. Life is calmer now, but the world can still be difficult. I learned that the hard way when I was deceived on that dating app by someone pretending to be someone else. The experience reminded me how vulnerable people like me can be when we are only looking for connection. I had believed I was speaking with a kind, understanding woman who shared my interests and my history. Instead, it turned out to be a cruel joke played by a stranger who enjoyed manipulating others from behind a screen. There was no dramatic confrontation, no satisfying resolution. I simply discovered the truth one quiet evening and blocked the profile for good. The whole thing left me embarrassed and cautious, but also wiser. Growing older has taught me that predators often look for those who seem gentle and trusting. Surviving moments like that requires patience, a clear head, and the willingness to walk away. Since then, I keep my circles small and my heart careful. Peace is more valuable to me than excitement. I have learned to trust slowly and to pay attention to the small warning signs I once ignored. Some lessons arrive softly, without noise or spectacle, and they stay with you far longer than any dramatic story ever could. My thoughts are with anyone walking the same path I did, especially growing up in the current climate for many different reasons. The story stands as a cautionary example of the challenges trans women often face. It is something I have carried with me all my life, though it felt heavier when I was younger. So, back to the dating app. I matched with another trans woman who said she was in her 30s. She looked slightly familiar in her pictures, and I wondered if I had noticed her on the app before. She also appeared closer to my age, but some of us have lived rough lives. From reading her profile, she sounded like a good match and someone fun to meet. So, I sent her a message. We traded a few texts and arranged to meet for dinner at a small bistro in the Castro district of San Francisco. When I showed up, the maitre d' led me to my regular table. Yes, I am the kind of person who has a regular table at a gay bistro. I sat down and enjoyed a glass of wine while waiting for my date, Danielle. The person who finally took the seat across from me was a very masculine-looking individual in his 50s, dressed in a plain shirt and tie. He clearly was not making any effort to present as a trans woman, but I tried to keep an open mind. Maybe I had misunderstood, and he was actually a drag performer. If that was the case, he would soon be disappointed. I am only interested in women of any kind, not men pretending to be women, even though I respect their choices. So I asked him, "Hey, are you Danielle?" And he answered, "No, I'm actually Danielle's dad." He strongly pointed out that he was straight for some reason, and explained that he learned his daughter had a date with me and wanted to meet me first because he is protective and worried about her getting hurt since she is trans. As if I am not. Naturally, the whole situation felt suspicious, and I began to feel certain I had seen this man somewhere before. 1. I was completely convinced that this man actually was Danielle, though if Danielle truly was his daughter, a family resemblance could explain it. 2. I was also completely sure that I had seen him lurking awkwardly around several of the bars I usually visit in the Castro district, places that are not exactly common territory for straight fathers. So the man told me his name was Daniel. Another warning sign. Daniel and Danielle. He said he was sorry for the trick, but asked if I would spend the evening with him so he could decide whether I was safe enough for Danielle to meet later. I should have refused right then, because I was already beginning to understand exactly what kind of catfish situation I had walked into. I can be a confident woman who never turns down a free meal and a free drink. So I told him, "Sure, I'll sit with you, as long as you're paying." And he replied, "Of course, a lady like you should never have to split the bill." Fair enough. We kept talking for a while, and it became obvious that he was interested in me. Daniel seemed to forget entirely that he even had a daughter named Danielle the moment our food arrived. He was simply curious about me, and especially focused on asking whether I had gone through the surgery. Yes. He asked strange things, like whether that meant I was biologically a woman now, and whether doctors had placed a womb inside me. All kinds of uncomfortable and awkward questions. Keep in mind that this happened just before the pandemic, so it was not as if information about how everything worked was impossible to find. I finally told him that some of those questions were things he should probably look up on his own or ask Megan about. By that point, we had already finished eating, and honestly, the guy became extremely apologetic. I actually started to feel a little sorry for him. Then he began doing that awkward thing some men do when they try too hard to make up for a mistake. He said things like how he wished he were trans himself, and how he felt spiritually trans. He even added that he would have voted for trans President Reagan if that had been possible. He did not literally say that last part, but it sounded just as uncomfortable as that. I finally decided I had reached my limit. I looked directly at him and told him there was no Megan at all. He stayed quiet for a few seconds. So I went on and asked if he really just wanted to go on a date with me. He slowly nodded and admitted he was attracted to me. He explained that he knew I only dated women, so he pretended to be a trans woman on the app. I tried to handle the situation calmly and carefully. I told him there was nothing wrong with a straight man being interested in a trans woman, but I also told him there was something very wrong with deceiving people and pretending to be a woman when he was not. He pushed back by reminding me that my profile clearly said I was open to dating trans women, whether they had surgery or not. I answered that yes, I meant women because I am a lesbian. He seemed completely unable to understand why that mattered. Eventually, I told him that none of those details were really the main issue. The real problem was that he had created an entire fake identity on a dating app. He invented a trans daughter and used all of it to trick me. I told him that surely he could see how wrong and unsettling that was. He suddenly looked frustrated and almost annoyed. It was obvious he still believed the situation might somehow turn out in his favor. Then he asked if I would at least consider spending the night with him. He said maybe I would change my mind and that he did not really mean the things he said about having a transgender soul. I again tried to stay as gentle as I could. I repeated that there was nothing wrong with a straight man wanting to date a trans woman, but there was definitely something wrong with lying to people and pretending to be someone else. He once more pointed to my profile and said it clearly stated I was willing to date trans women with or without surgery. I answered the same way as before and reminded him that I meant women because I am a lesbian. He still could not grasp that it made any difference at all. In the end, I told him that none of his arguments changed the important fact. The important fact was that he had completely posed as another person online. He fabricated a whole story about having a trans daughter and used it to catfish me. I told him again that this behavior was dishonest and genuinely frightening. Now he appeared furious, and I honestly believed things might still settle down. But then he asked, would I consider spending the night with him? Maybe my feelings would change, and he truly meant it when he said he carried a woman's soul inside him, and that my surgery made no difference. And that was the exact moment I understood he was nothing more than a committed chaser. Typically, it is a person who insists they are straight, but secretly fetishizes and pursues pre-operation trans women. Most of them target people far younger than I am, but I suppose Derek had a taste for older partners as well. And I told him, why don't you adjust your profile on the app so you are not pretending to be your own trans daughter, and instead just list yourself as bisexual and open to men and women? Well, good God, that turned out to be a terrible idea. Are you calling me a filthy slur? Derek shouted, jumping up from the table and shoving it aside, sending what was left of our wine splashing into the meals of the diners nearby. I jerk back and think, whoa, this guy went from calm to insane in a heartbeat. And then I realize he is gripping a fork and moving straight toward me. He keeps yelling about how dare I accuse him with a slur, and loudly claims that I tricked him, insisting I pretended to be a man just to lure him on a date. He has no clue that nearly everyone inside the Riverside Bistro actually knows who I am. So, to begin with, his accusation is ridiculous. Next, while stepping away from his swinging fork, I ask him how any of that adds up, since he insists he is a straight man. How could I possibly have deceived him in that way? And he just keeps rambling without making sense. And when he cannot come up with an answer, the maniac lunges at me with the fork, trying to drive the utensil right into my face. And one of the other customers there that evening happened to be the kindest, calmest gay man in his mid-50s you could ever meet. And he also happened to be a rugged motorcycle rider, a classic leather scene type, and a former Marine. So the instant he rose from his chair and placed himself between me and Derek, I knew the situation was finished. My friend, who will stay unnamed because he technically broke the law that night, grabs Derek's wrist with the fork and squeezes hard enough that I am certain something cracked. And then he delivers a punch to the stomach that looked strong enough to drop a wild bull. Derek is thrown backward, slamming into another table and knocking plates of food everywhere. So now he has an angry guy in his 20s and that man's lesbian best friend furious with him as well. and everyone in the room is shouting at Derek, labeling him a chaser, a liar, a creep, and plenty worse. And then, without warning, the entire place fell quiet, and the young man whose dinner had just been ruined, someone I barely knew, spoke up with the sharpest and most brutal comment of the entire night. "Sweetheart," he said to Derek in an exaggerated, campy, stylist voice that was completely different from his normal tone. "Sweetheart," he added, "you must have serious nerve to show up on a date in Midtown wearing an outfit that a clueless office clerk from a cheap sitcom would be embarrassed to own." Daniel was still shaking from the punch thrown by Steel Bear. But this was essentially the final blow, and he stared at all of us with a truly vicious expression. Then he shouted the strangest and most awkward sentence I have ever heard in my life. "I hope Ross Perot sends all of you back to England." After that, he bolted straight out of the restaurant. For a few seconds, we were too shocked to move. And then several of us ran outside after him, only to see a car speeding out of the parking lot. None of us managed to catch his license plate number, but many security cameras in the area did. The owner of the bistro eventually took him to court and made him pay for the damage. We chose to minimize certain details so that one person would not end up facing assault charges. Fortunately, Daniel decided to stay quiet about that part. That same night, I went home feeling completely tricked and humiliated, and opened the app to block Danielle Davis. The account had already disappeared. Here is another story from my family. This story happened to my aunt when she was in her 40s, sometime around 1998. Back then, very few people owned webcams, but my aunt was always comfortable with new technology and spent a lot of time in early internet chat rooms provided by America Online. She never remembered exactly where she met the man, only that it was some kind of public chat room. He told her he was a successful writer, and she had always been drawn to people who sounded intelligent and well-read, so they quickly became friends. She often asked him to share the books he had written, but he kept refusing in a playful way and promised that he would reveal everything to her one day. Over time, their conversations turned into an online romance, even though meeting strangers from the internet was considered very risky in those days. My aunt lived in Detroit, Michigan, and the man claimed to live in Austin, Texas, and they eventually discussed the idea of her flying there to meet him in person. She kept teasing him about proving his identity, and he finally sent a few scanned photographs, but the pictures did not resemble any known authors. He insisted that most writers were not recognized by their faces anyway, which was fairly believable in the years before social media became common. What he did send her, though, were edited scans of his bank account, which she still insists looked completely legitimate. He clearly had money, and whether it truly came from being an author was another question. But that part did not seem to be a lie. It also turned out to be true when she received a plane ticket in the mail, paid for under his real name, along with a deposit sent directly to her bank account to cover travel expenses. He told my aunt he genuinely loved her and wanted to be with her, and she believed him and felt the same. So my aunt arrived at the airport ready to fly out to Denver, excited and nervous, when an unexpected flash storm suddenly rolled in. The flight ended up delayed for an entire day, and she became frantic because she needed to let her man know what was happening. We should probably give him a name. I will call him Evan, since that was the name he claimed to use. Eventually, arrangements were made for my aunt to stay overnight in a nearby hotel. From there, she tried to call Evan on the landline number he had given her, but no one answered. It made sense at the time, because her plane should have been landing right then, and he would have already been on his way to meet her at the airport. She could only hope the airline would notify people that the flight from Boston to Denver had been delayed and would not arrive until the following afternoon. She left a message on his answering machine, but because she was calling from a hotel landline, she had no idea what number to leave for him to reach her. He never called back, but she boarded the rescheduled flight anyway, and prayed he would be there when she landed. There was no sign of Evan at the airport, and she waited around for a long time, hoping he would show up. But he never did. Fortunately, my aunt had an address for him, and even though the cab ride was expensive, she decided to go there. The house was modest, a small, single-story place that did not really match the image of a wealthy, successful author, though it did not completely rule it out either. My aunt knocked on the door, peered through the windows, and searched around for a spare key or any sign of life. After a while, an elderly neighbor stepped outside and asked what she was doing. My aunt broke down in tears and explained everything. The neighbors seemed uneasy about the situation, which was understandable. But when my aunt showed her the photo Evan had mailed to her months earlier, the neighbor confirmed that the picture was of the man who lived in that house. However, his name was not Evan. That alone did not necessarily prove anything, since people sometimes use different names. My aunt then asked the neighbor whether the man was an author, and according to my aunt, the woman first appeared ready to say yes, then quickly hesitated and changed her answer, claiming instead that he worked some ordinary job she did not really know much about. My aunt decided to stay in a hotel at her own expense for a few more days, calling Evan again and again. Eventually, his answering machine became full, and she could no longer leave any messages at all. Heartbroken, my aunt returned to Ohio. Thankfully, she managed to move her flight to an earlier date, and she never heard from Ethan again. I grew up hearing the story. I had been a little kid when it happened, and only knew that my aunt had met someone, and later, that everything had gone wrong. Mom told me brief versions of it over the years, but eventually, in the mid-2000s, my aunt cornered me at a Thanksgiving dinner and said she wanted to share the whole story because she knew I was interested in mysteries and true crime and things like that. And something had never sat right with her about the whole experience. So the story I have just told you is the story she told me, and it truly did sound like she had been catfished. But the thing that truly stayed with me was the reason behind it. Ethan seemed to have nothing to gain from the situation aside from simple cruelty. Maybe it was only my aunt's unwillingness to hate him, but it really did not sound like he meant to hurt her. At least, not in the way he finally did. Later, I did some digging, even though I did not have much to go on. An author who disappeared on a certain date, whose name may or may not have been Ethan, but was not the name he published under. I convinced myself that the man had not catfished my aunt, and that something else had happened instead. So I searched for authors who died around that time, and nothing really came up. Then, on a small stroke of luck, I asked my aunt if she still had the address for Ethan. A few weeks later, she managed to find it on an old printout of an email she had kept from back then, believe it or not. And I looked up the address itself and the past owners. It had been owned by a man named Frank, then the next name, and the next owner had the same name, and an online search suggested that it was his son. So I looked up Frank and that name, and there was not much information about him from back in the 90s. But then I got pulled down a rabbit hole on a sadly now defunct message board about conspiracies and missing people. The thread had appeared in my search for his name, but I did not immediately see how it connected. It was a thread about a female romance mystery author, locally published in the area of Austin, Texas, where Ethan had lived. The thread had started with the original poster, wondering if anyone remembered these books. There were about 5 or 6 of them, and they were typical Harlequin-style romances. But the poster remembered them containing passages that read almost as if they were written in some kind of code, like strange, unusual sections that did not seem to fit with the rest of the otherwise ordinary romance novels. I read more and more of the thread, and that was when Mark Harrison's name came up. The female romance author, C.R. Mallory, seemed to be self-published back in the days when self-publishing was extremely costly and hard. and her book was a staple at local fairs and craft events and bookstores. But all the stalls were manned by someone claiming to be the author's brother, Mark Harrison, and then the name. As the thread went on, these sleuths began to dig further and discover the Mark Harrison name was spelled Harrison, like Harrison, which allowed them to discover that on the afternoon my aunt was flying into Denver, a man named Mark Harrison had gone off the road on a cliff-top path and crashed through the guardrail, dying instantly. And so I was just there, thinking, holy crap, my aunt did not get catfished. Her lover tragically died on the way to meet her. But then the post continued. A few posters swore that their relatives had eloped with a guy named Mark Harrison Blake, who lived in Denver. All of them had cut off their friends and family and claimed that they were living with Mark Harrison on a commune of sorts. A commune nobody could actually prove even existed. So now we have Mark Harrison Blake meeting multiple women on the internet throughout the 90s, paying to get them to fly to Denver, and then they all mysteriously disappeared. Some of the posters even had proof of missing person reports, which they posted scans of. And then one final post really chilled me to the bone. They claimed that they used to work for the Denver County Sheriff's Office, and that they would get in a lot of trouble for posting these recordings. But this was the tape taken from Mark Harrison's answering machine after his death. I listened to it all. There were multiple messages from my aunt on there, along with a couple from two other women who seemed to be in some kind of early-stage relationship with Mark. But the most chilling one was the message received just before the final two messages from my aunt, in which she desperately tried to explain that her flight had been delayed by a day. It was a male voice saying that Mark Harrison had let them down one too many times, that the goods had been scheduled to arrive in Denver that day, and a lot of effort had been made to ensure everything was running smoothly. Mark Harrison apparently should have booked a different flight route for the goods to ensure that there were no weather delays. I thought about posting, saying the other messages were from my aunt. I thought about telling her. I had no idea what to do. Now, I saved that file and ultimately decided to just selectively take bits of the information. So, to this day, my aunt believes that Mark Harrison tragically met his death while driving to the airport to meet her. It was a tale of doomed love, and it gave her closure. But there is so much that does not make sense to me. Romance has always been a profitable genre, but a self-published romance writer would not have been earning the kind of money in the 1990s that my aunt claims she saw on Frank Reed's bank statements. All right, maybe she misunderstood the numbers, but there were also the strange coded paragraphs that a few posters remembered seeing inside the books. And there were no photographs or scans of the books themselves anywhere online. It did not sound like they had ever been widely distributed. Only about 3 members of the Odd Lost Media Forum I discovered had ever actually read them, and they had all grown up in 1990s Portland, Oregon. I wish I had posted on the forum, or at least spoken to 1 or 2 people there, because the entire site was shut down while I was still trying to decide what to do. And the closure had nothing to do with Frank Reed. There was unrelated drama involving a far more serious political topic that caused the forum to collapse, and the hosting providers simply decided to remove it entirely. The administrator left a final message explaining that they no longer felt safe keeping the community online, and after that, it disappeared. But here is what I believe now. My aunt was deceived, but not in the way she originally imagined. Frank Reed was involved in some kind of human trafficking network, or possibly a cult operation, where he lured certain women across the country by pretending to be a successful novelist, selecting them based on criteria I still cannot fully understand. He truly was a writer, and he certainly had money, but almost everything about his identity was fabricated. And the other women who supposedly ran away with him all told their families over the phone that they wanted no further contact. In those days, situations like that were rarely investigated very deeply. I am convinced that Frank Reed was not the harmless romantic figure I allowed my aunt to believe he was. And whatever scheme he intended for her was far darker than simply bringing her to Portland and abandoning her. I only wish I knew the truth of what really happened. This next part is a bit unusual, but a few years ago I managed a small Discord server for friends who followed me on Twitch or spent time with me in other online spaces. I am sharing this detail because it connects directly to what happened later. I am what people describe as ace arrow, meaning I have never experienced romantic attraction at any point in my life. As a woman, being open about that in an online community can be useful because some men on Discord behave in predictable ways. By making it clear from the beginning that there was absolutely no possibility of romance, I found it a little easier to avoid uncomfortable situations. It did not solve every problem, but it helped somewhat. Then a particular member joined the community, and I will refer to him as Nolan. He mostly stayed quiet, occasionally commenting on conversations or asking if he could join our group gaming nights. He did take part from time to time, although he never used a microphone. One day, completely out of the blue, I received an enormous direct message from him that stretched on for thousands of words. At first, I assumed I already knew what was coming and wondered if it was even worth reading. I went through it anyway and discovered it was exactly what I expected. A strange and completely unwarranted confession of love. Normally, I try to be sympathetic toward messages like that because it is not anyone's fault that I am ace and arrow and have about as much interest in physical contact as I do in a meat grinder. I always attempt to respond kindly, even though I have been very open in public that I am not looking for a relationship and never will be. The heart wants what it wants. Ethan Cole, however, did not simply say he had a crush on me. He insisted we were soulmates and that destiny had already decided we belonged together. He claimed things could easily work between us and that he knew this because we shared very specific tastes that supposedly proved the connection. I will not go through every example he listed, but a few of the stranger ones stuck with me. He pointed out that we had both played the old Night Bureau interactive movie game on the first PlayStation when we were kids, and later the sequel on PlayStation 2. As further proof of our supposed destiny, he mentioned that we had both played obscure survival horror titles like Spectre Pulse on PS2. In his mind, that was meaningful evidence. I understood that not many people had played that game because it was terrible, and the main character looked like a creepy puppet, but that coincidence did not make us soulmates. Then he brought up what he considered the ultimate proof, the original Blackwood Myth computer game that connected to the Midnight Realm universe. All of it sounded incredibly nerdy, because it absolutely was. I am a longtime horror fan and a horror game developer, and a friend of mine in the same field is part of the online storytelling community and encouraged me to share my experience. Playing those kinds of games is practically part of my job, even though it was mildly unusual that we had both experienced those 4 obscure titles. None of that meant we were meant to be together, or that being with Ethan could somehow change the fact that I am not biologically or romantically attracted to people. I am not talking about rarely being in the mood or only feeling a little interest. I mean, I am completely not. No amount of shared gaming nostalgia was ever going to alter that reality. The message somehow managed to become even more unsettling. He wrote that despite everything he had said, he understood we could never be together, because he had heard me laughing on a live stream at jokes told by another member of the community. According to him, that moment proved I was already in love with someone else. He claimed to possess a sixth sense for reading those situations, and that he instantly knew there was something romantic between me and that other person. He finished by saying he did not want to interfere with what he believed we had. The reason he was telling me all of this was to apologize in advance, if he seemed moody or irritated with me going forward. First, the guy he was talking about was my effing brother, Daniel, who had appeared on my streams a couple of times. So, yeah, amazing sixth sense, pal. I guess Frank hadn't been logged on, or conveniently ignored the many times we mentioned that Daniel was my sibling. Or maybe he decided that because we're adopted siblings, it somehow didn't count or something. Gross, man. He's my brother. This was all seriously creeping me out at this point. But basically, this massive essay was a long excuse to guilt trip me and explain why he planned to act cold toward me in the community from then on. I didn't want that. So, as politely as I could manage, I sent him a message saying this was all a little too intense for me and crossed several of my boundaries, and I wasn't comfortable keeping someone around me or my friends who had behaved this way toward me. So I think I'm going to have to remove him from the server and ban him. I asked him to confirm that he'd seen the message with a thumbs up and then blocked him. And now, jump ahead a year. I was recruiting for a small indie game my friend was developing, and I was helping him out as an art director and searching for talent for the position. I put out a call on different platforms, looking for people to help him out, and one applicant truly stood out. Their resume said they were a 23-year-old, non-binary, Canadian femme-presenting artist, and their work was genuinely impressive, really incredible art, and they were local, which meant they could come into our shared workspace for an in-person interview. Perfect. I thought my friend would be excited, and so was I. I emailed back and forth with this artist, who agreed on a date and time to come in and meet with me. It was just me in the office that day, because the game director got pulled away on some urgent business. There was a knock on the door, and a person stepped inside. I checked the time and, yeah, this was supposed to be my meeting with the artist. Now, I'm not trying to be unfair about anyone's appearance. If they say they're femme-presenting and maybe don't quite match what I imagine as femme-presenting, okay. But when the 23-year-old non-binary femme-presenting artist looks, sounds, and is dressed like a 43-year-old balding bearded man from Cleveland, even I have my limits. He wore an old Thunderstrike band t-shirt that stretched tight over his hairy beer gut. He looked like a heavier version of some washed-up roadie if he'd gained 100 pounds, lived in a van for half a year, and never touched a shower. He smelled like it too. And he just sort of marched in, closed the door behind him, and I didn't notice it, but he locked it, and took a seat on the other side of my desk, completely uninvited. I asked him if I could help him, and he said he was Claire Novak, the artist here about the job. Of course, alarm bells were ringing, so I said, "You're a 23-year-old woman from Portland, Oregon." And he nodded and said, "Yes," in a very obviously American accent. I had no idea what I should do. I was terrified of being hit with some discrimination complaint or something. But this heavy, bearded man clearly was not a 23-year-old woman from Oregon. Then I noticed a tattoo on his wrist. It was the stick figure symbol from the Silver Lake slasher movie, and a sinking feeling suddenly washed over me. I had never seen him in person back then, but he had once sent a photo of that same tattoo. By then, it was obvious who he really was. Derek Holman. He saw me looking at the tattoo and understood that the lie was finished. And so I asked him directly if he had pretended to be a young woman online just to meet me. Derek leaned toward me and said that he knew once I saw him and we made eye contact, I would realize that we were meant to be together, that the connection would unlock something inside me, and I would no longer be broken in the ways that I was, and the power of our bond would repair me. I was furious, so I stood up and stormed to the door and tried to leave, and that was when I realized he had locked it. Luckily, it was only one of those simple catches that you flip. But as I was trying to unlock it, Derek was already on his feet and grabbing me. He pulled me away from the door surprisingly gently and whispered in my ear that as soon as I felt him against me, as soon as our bodies touched, I would understand. It turned into one of the scariest and most unpleasant experiences of my life. There was certainly no magical realization. If I had ever felt interested in romance before, then Derek's touch somehow pushed that feeling far below zero. I told him that no, I did not feel anything at all. And if he did not let go of me immediately, he was going to feel something very unwelcome. I was shaking and trembling with fear, and my threat came out thin and weak, like a frightened child, so I doubt it scared him very much. I did get a sudden burst of strength, though, because the idea of this repulsive stranger doing something unspeakable to me was more than I could bear. I fumbled for the door lock while also pounding on it and screaming for help, hoping some of the other people who used the shared offices in the building were there that day. The security guard at the entrance must have been around, because someone had allowed Derek upstairs, and I managed to get the door open and run out, with Derek rushing after me. For a big man, he was fast. It also sounded like he was having real trouble keeping up. We were on the 4th floor of a rented co-working building in Denver, Colorado, so I had the bright idea to run down the stairs. I was in decent shape, and he clearly was not, so I hoped that might slow him down. I underestimated his determination, though, because by the time I reached the 3rd floor, still calling for help, it sounded like Derek was getting closer, if anything. I decided to turn and risk looking back, and that was when I saw him. Sort of leap or fall, I do not know. He just flung himself belly first down the stairs toward me, maybe trying to land on me like a wrestler completely out of his mind. Fortunately, I stepped aside, and he slammed against the wall and then staggered at the top of the stairs. And then that guy bounced, rolled, and crashed down 2 full flights of stairs, screaming and howling in pain the entire time. Now, despite myself, I was a little worried that he was going to actually break his neck. So I ended up running down after him just in time to see him hit the floor face first. And then suddenly other people showed up, bursting through the stairwell door, asking what was happening because they thought they heard a disturbance. I told building security everything, and they immediately called the police. Derek was not in good shape. He ended up with several broken ribs, a broken arm, and worst of all, his chest and Lily's vintage band shirt had ripped straight down from throat to sternum. And I am pretty sure that was a real piece from the 80s. Now, anyway, it was difficult to get any serious charge to stick to him. He had only technically assaulted me, which I did press charges for, and it was enough to get a restraining order against him too. But I think the number of people who warned him that they would make sure his life was miserable if he ever came near me again was enough to keep him away. Hopefully, he no longer believes we are soulmates. And I can tell you one thing, being grabbed by that man certainly did not change my mind about having no interest in dating. So I am a grown woman who still gets nervous listening to your stories like a small child. Now, I will not share my exact age, but I am old enough that when this happened to my mother, the term catfishing did not even exist, and would not for a good few decades after that. So the way she tells it, she had the wool pulled over her eyes, so to speak. I do not know if people use that expression in America, but it comes from I really have no idea. Actually, I suppose it means covering someone's face with a sweater. And perhaps some clever person could explain it better. So, back when my mom was an eligible bachelorette in the 1960s, a friend of hers, called Megan, convinced her to go on a date with this man. She said he was a real catch, easy on the eyes and generous with his money, if you get what I mean. Not only that, but he was a rising figure in the growing Los Angeles film scene. We all know the United States has produced some unforgettable movies like Jaws, The Godfather, and of course, Halloween. Now, Mom's friend Megan was making all these hints that a big-shot director, who we'll just call Richard, had some connections to a legendary filmmaker named Victor Halston, who was supposedly his mentor or something. And he was looking for a leading lady who Megan thought sounded a lot like Mom. Mom fancied herself as a bit of an actress. She had done some school plays and even appeared in a few small shows at the community theater a couple of times, which in those days was basically like being treated as Broadway royalty. Back then, Mom was sweet on a guy named Daniel, so she was a little reluctant to agree to this date with director Richard. But Megan was insistent, and that was how things supposedly worked in the entertainment world. Apparently, he would not expect anything from her, just a polite and friendly dinner date. Because who ever heard of a powerful film executive behaving badly with women? I mean, let's not even get started on the fact that this was not Hollywood at all. It was Chicago. But you get the point. Anyway, Mom decided that she would go for it and simply not tell Daniel, and hope that he understood when she explained how she had gotten her big break and was about to become a star. She got all dressed up. I have seen the photos. She looked classy, like you could genuinely believe that she was heading to a red carpet premiere, with how stylish she looked. And when she got out of the taxi at the place where she had been told to meet Richard, her Hollywood dreams began to melt away. I guess calling it a restaurant was very generous. It was more like one of those grim little diners you find tucked between old buildings. If you have ever been to Chicago, you will know the kind of place I mean. Dark, dingy, cramped little rooms that stink of stale cigar smoke, with carpets stickier than a strip of old tape. As soon as she entered, a guy sitting at a table in the back waved her over. She knew immediately that this was her date. Mom was not sure who or what she had been picturing with Richard. Megan had made him sound like a movie star, but also warned Mom not to get her hopes up too high in the looks department. Then Megan followed that up with a wink, implying that he did have the charm to back up his reputation. At that point, Mom would have been happy with a younger version of Victor Halston, or anyone who was not Richard, really. And the way Mom tells it, Richard looked like some kind of comic book character, and not in a good way. He was barely 5 feet tall and thin as a rake, and somehow still had a round belly on him that would rival an aging prizefighter in his later years. He had this huge, long nose above, and Mom swears this is true, a mustache that he could absolutely in no way be unaware looked like a certain infamous Austrian painter. Immediately in her mind, Mom started thinking of Richard as a strange mixture of that old filmmaker and that long-dead dictator, all based on his enormous nose and the unsettling resemblance that she could not stop noticing. The comment made her laugh at her own small joke as she took a seat. The man everyone later called Hancock must have said something he believed was amusing, because he wore a grin so wide and sharp that my mother felt as if he might swallow her whole. He had crooked yellow teeth, though she always said that sort of thing was common for working men in Boston back then. Since Hancock claimed to be an important figure in the film business, she expected his teeth to look at least somewhat clean. They settled at the table, and Hancock ordered the least expensive wine on the menu, giving her a proud look, as if he had chosen a rare bottle from Paris. Then he began talking endlessly about the movies he planned to create, and how famous he was going to become, and how impossible it was to convince studios to trust him, and how nobody understood his vision. He told her that with a talented woman like my mother joining the team, success would be certain. When she asked what he meant by a third member, Hancock made a show of checking an old pocket watch and announced that Ron should arrive at any moment. My mother felt confused and unsure of herself. She said she had assumed he was Ron. Hancock burst out laughing and explained that he was not Ron at all. He introduced himself as Garrett Reed, the producer, and said he intended to sit through her meeting with Ron to observe how well they connected. At that point, my mother felt completely lost, because Dana had assured her that this was supposed to be a real date with a promising man named Ron who could help her acting career. Hancock suddenly turned toward the door when the bell rang and declared that the guest of honor had arrived. In walked a woman my mother never forgot. She later described Ronnie as looking like an exaggerated stage performer pretending to be several different people at once. Her appearance matched every cruel stereotype of an aggressive barroom flirt. She even had a wild perm, except only the left side of her hair seemed to have curled, while the right side hung flat and lifeless. I have always wished I could have seen that strange woman with my own eyes, but I was not even born yet. Over the years, I've searched for any trace of her, hoping to find a single photograph to prove that my mother had not exaggerated the memory. Ronnie dropped into her chair, ordered Hancock to bring her 2 bottles of beer, and waited without speaking until they arrived. She finished the first drink in one long swallow, let out a heavy belch, and finally turned to face my mother. "Christ, you're a hot little firecracker, aren't you?" she says with a grin. My mother is clearly taken aback. The woman introduces herself as Roxy Bennett. Mom tries to joke and asks if she means Bennett like the Dalton brothers. Roxy stares at her as if a look alone could wound and asks whether she resembles a rugged outlaw. Mom has no idea what to answer because, despite obviously being a woman, Roxy carried herself with the swagger of a tough barroom brawler. Then she laughs, squeezes Mom's hand and says, "Not to worry, darling. She can call her anything, as long as she calls." Mom only nods, completely thrown off balance. So Victor Hayes announces that he will let the 2 ladies get acquainted. This is merely a screen test, as they both understand, and they only need to act out a romantic dinner between 2 secret lovers. He explains that Mom's character, Clara Mayfield, comes from a wealthy ranching family, and Roxy's character, Nina Doyle, is the daughter of a feared Chicago crime boss. Mom points out that if she is playing the daughter of a ranch owner, the character must be American. Hayes looks genuinely puzzled by this, as if the thought never crossed his mind, and then waves his hand and says the details of the plot do not really matter. For the next half hour, Mom and Roxy order the greasiest plate of spaghetti imaginable and sit there picking at it while making awkward small talk, as Hayes occasionally tells them to turn up the heat and be a little more affectionate. Mom has always been an open-minded woman, but that attitude never included being groped by a total stranger. So she feels uneasy about the whole situation. She also begins to suspect that she has been misled by both Lila Monroe and Hayes. So she asks Hayes exactly how he knows Lila. Mom worked with Lila in the clerical office of a small insurance company, and they had become casual friends. Hayes laughs and says Lila is his niece, and she often sends promising women his way for his productions. Mom is quickly losing her patience. She slams her fork onto the table and demands that Hayes and Roxy explain what kind of movie this is supposed to be, and why she must eat spaghetti in a seductive manner as a screen test when there are no cameras anywhere in sight. Roxy sighs and tells her she must be very innocent because this is an adult picture, a dirty film, and the neighborhood is famous for that kind of business. No, my dear sweet mother had not known anything of the sort, and she stands up to leave. Hayes stops her before she reaches the door. He insists it is only a film between 2 women, so it is not truly improper at all, and the equipment they use is so poor that no one would ever recognize her. Mom remains unconvinced. Then Hayes pulls a check from his jacket pocket. He says perhaps this will help her reconsider, and he even arches his eyebrows as if making an irresistible offer. $10 to appear in an hour-long piece of sleaze with a woman who might be the twin sister of a hard-boiled gangster, supervised by a man who looked like a bargain basement version of a notorious dictator. Mom just laughed, stood up, thanked them for their time, and started toward the door. Martin Hale hurried after her, trying to invent every possible reason she ought to stay a little longer. Mom glanced back over her shoulder and later swore she caught a look of tight resignation on Renee's face. And just then, the door to the restaurant swung open and 3 neatly dressed men in suits stepped inside. These were exactly the sort of men Mom had been led to believe Elliot Harper was supposed to be. They looked her up and down, nodded to one another with approval, and one of them asked Hale if this was the talent they had been promised and were investing in. Mom said she was actually on her way out, but wished them luck with their movie. The older, heavy-set man of the group looked at Hale and said, "Not again, pal. You are not cheating us again." And the younger man, in a white suit with a calm smile, took Mom aside and asked her exactly what she had been promised. She explained that she had been tricked into coming on this date and then pressured to eat spaghetti with a predatory woman while Hale sat there watching. Mom was not the kind of woman to be shy or intimidated by Chicago street toughs. She had grown up around them. And the man in the white suit told her his name was Daniel, and that everything would be fine. In fact, he said he would walk her to the bus if she wanted, and even drive her home, since his car was parked nearby. Either way, he said he thought it might be better if they left right away, because a few more of his associates were arriving any minute. And sure enough they did, greeting Daniel with respectful nods as if he were someone important, even though they were much older than him. As the door jingled shut behind Mom, the sounds of crashing, smashing, and shouting began. Mom, always the curious type, tried to turn back and look inside to see what was happening. But Daniel gently yet firmly guided her away and told her she seemed far too nice a woman to star in Elliot's grimy films, and definitely too nice to witness what was taking place inside the Red Fox Tavern at that moment. Renee came bursting out the door, limping on one heel, laughing loudly and calling out to Mom that it had been nice to meet her. That made Mom feel a little better. "Do not worry," Daniel said. "Nobody is going to get killed over a cheap adult movie. Just some lessons are going to be taught after all." And the warmth in his eyes and the kindness in his voice were what finally convinced Mom to let him give her a ride home. And she usually ends the story there. But when she tells it to us kids, she always adds that, as we already know, she invited Daniel up for coffee. The story of Daniel is a whole other tale. He is my dad and the father of my 2 older siblings, but not my younger sister. He has lived a very interesting life, but I would say an honorable one. And ultimately, I feel like if Mom had not been tricked into almost starring in that movie, I probably would not have been born. Tommy, I have never called him Dad, strangely enough, is one of my best friends, and we have all manner of bizarre stories like that, but I do not think any of them are quite as scary as the time before I was even a thought in Mom or Tommy's life. That petty tyrant and Marla Hensley almost got my mom killed in a Chicago gangster bar brawl. And as a side note, Mom did eventually end up meeting the real Ronald Crane shortly before he was sent away, and she says that he was much more polite and much more civilized than the Ronald Crane that she almost starred in that film with, so I suppose that is nice.